Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel JB's Lecture. I am G Bhattacharya and today in this video I shall read the rest of the part of the story The Sound Machine. And dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around him as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one inside except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. Clonzer looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing inside. He saw her reaching down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses, and turned to walk away. "Mrs. Saunders?" Klosner shouted, and his voice was high and shrill with excitement. "Oh, Mrs. Saunders!" The woman looked around, and she saw her neighbor standing on his lawn. A fantastic arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed. "Cut another one! Please cut another one quickly!" She stood still, staring at him. "Why, Mr. Clonzer?" she said. "What's the matter?" "Please do as I ask," he said. "Cut just one more rose." Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. No, she thought. No, he's harmless. I will just humor him. "Certainly, Mr. Clonzer, if you like," she said. She took her scissors from the basket, bent down and snipped another rose. Again Clonzer heard that frightful throatless shriek in the earphones. Again it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens. "All right," he said. "That's enough. No more. Please, no more." The woman stood there holding the yellow rose that she had just cut, looking at him. "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders," he said. "Something that you won't believe." He put his hands on the top of the fence and peered at her intently through his thick spectacles. "You have this evening cut a basketful of rose. You have with a sharp pair of scissors cut through the stems of living things, and each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders?" "No," she said. "I certainly didn't know that." "It happens to be true," he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement. "I heard them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard the cry of pain, a very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it. You might say," he went on, "that a rose bush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You would be right, it hasn't. No, not like ours anyway, but how do you know, Mrs. Saunders?" And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. "How do you know that a rose bush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem in two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it?" "Yes, Mr. Klosner. Oh, yes." and good night. And quickly she turned and ran up the garden to her house. Klausner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could still hear the faint, spasmodic crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. Slowly he bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint, high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't so sure now that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain, it was surprise, or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the rose. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else which we didn't know about, something called toin or spurl or reenactment or anything you like. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shade and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him and walked up to the house. The next morning, Plonzer was up as soon as it was light. He dressed and went straight to the shed. He picked the machine up and carried it outside, clasping it to his chest with both hands, walking unsteadily under its weight. He went past the house, out through the front gate, and across the road to the park. There he paused and looked around him. Then he went on until he came to a large tree, a beech tree, and he placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Quickly he went back to the house and got an axe from the coal cellar and carried it across the road into the park. He put the axe on the ground beside the tree. Then he looked around him again, peering nervously through his thick glasses in every direction. There was no one about. It was 6 in the morning. He put the earphones on his head and switched on the machine. He listened for a moment to the faint familiar humming sound. Then he picked up the axe, took a stance with his legs wide apart, and swung the axe as hard as he could at the base of the tree trunk. The blade cut deep into the wood and stuck there, and at the instant of impact he heard a most extraordinary noise in the earphones. It was a new noise, unlike any he had heard before, a harsh, noteless, enormous noise, a growling, low-pitched, screaming sound, not quick and short like the noise of the rose, but drawn out like a sob, lasting for fully a minute, loudest at the moment when the axe struck, fading gradually, fainter and fainter, until it was gone. Plonzer stared in horror at the place where the blade of the axe had sunk into the wood flesh of the tree. Then gently he took the axe handle, worked the blade loose, and threw the thing on the ground. With his fingers he touched the gash that the axe had made in the wood, touching the edges of the gash, trying to press them together to close the wound. And he kept saying, "Tree, oh tree, I'm sorry, but it will heal fine." For a while he stood there with his hands upon the trunk of the great tree. Then suddenly he turned away and hurried off out of the park, across the road, through the front gate, and back into his house. He went to the telephone, consulted the book, dialed a number, and waited. He held the receiver tightly in his left hand and tapped the table impatiently with his right. He heard the telephone buzzing at the other end, and then the click of a lifted receiver and a man's voice, a sleepy voice, saying, "Hello, yes? Dr. Scott," he said. "Yes, speaking, Dr. Scott, you must come at once, quickly, please. Who is it speaking? Clowns are here. And you remember what I told you last night about my earphone with sound, and now I hoped I might." Yes, of course. But what's the matter? Are you ill? No, I'm not ill, but it's 6:30 in the morning, said the doctor, and you call me, but you are not ill. Please come quickly. I want someone to hear it. It's driving me mad. I can't believe it. The doctor heard the frantic, almost hysterical note in the man's voice, the same note he was used to hearing in the voices of people who called up and said, "Quickly." He said slowly, "You really want me to get out of bed and come over now?" "Yes, now, at once, please." "All right then, I shall come." Clonzer sat down beside the telephone and waited. He tried to remember what the shriek of the tree had sounded like, but he couldn't. He could remember only that it had been enormous and frightful, and that it had made him feel sick with horror. He tried to imagine what sort of noise a human would make if he had to stand anchored to the ground while someone deliberately sung a small sharp thing at his leg, so that the blade cut in deep and wedged itself in the cut. Same sort of noise, perhaps? No, quite different. The noise of the tree was worse than frightening, toneless, throatless quality. He began to wonder about other living things, and he thought immediately of a field of wheat standing up straight and yellow and alive, with the mower going through it, cutting the stems, 500 stems a second, every second. Oh my God, what would the noise be like? 500 wheat plants screaming together, and every second another 500 being cut and screaming. And no, he thought, no, I do not want to go to a wheat field with my machine. I would never eat bread after him, after that. But what about potatoes and cabbages and carrots and onions? And what about apples? No, apples are all right. They fall off naturally when they are ripe. Apples are all right if you let them fall off instead of tearing them from the tree branch, but not vegetables, not a potato, for example. A potato would surely shriek, so would a carrot and an onion and a cabbage. He heard the click of the front gate latch, and he jumped up and went out and saw the tall doctor coming down the path, his little black bag in hand. "Well," the doctor said, "well, what's all the trouble? Come with me, doctor. I want you to hear it. I called you because you are the only one I have told. It's over the road in the park. Will you come now?"